arrive before transmitting. We'll have like 20 minutes of silence before things start sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, this is something I picked up from the news center sessions. They kind of have these informal chats before starting transmission, and they start afterwards. They just wait it up, so they start transmitting afterwards. So actually, we are still talking bullshit. So, and we are already transmitting, so we are not really following our rules. So, yeah. Okay, so I am comrade number 073, and this is the project Form and Scale. I was talking to Gabriel about the possibility of kind of grounding what I'm trying to do right now with this Form and Scale project by approaching some of the things I did in my doctorate thesis, which was actually not about politics or economics or anything like that, or science for that matter. It was about aesthetics. I have a background as a musician, artist, whatever, and the project of the PhD was about I would say today it was about post-Cagean aesthetics, something that was inspired by the work of John Cage, and it was a pretty non-orthodox reading of what Cage was all about. So, and this brought me like imminently to the problem of organization. So the idea today is to kind of trace the steps from then to here, something like that, and to just present a very, very broad version of what I did in the thesis, and maybe a little bit earlier than the thesis, in order to maybe you guys help me to understand and construct the necessary bridges between the two projects, something like that. So this is my personal stake in here, in this, and I hope it's interesting anyway. So let's go. I'll start to share my PowerPoint with you guys. So let's do this. Is everybody listening okay?
Yeah, it's going well for me. I'm gonna mute my computer just so there's no reverb.
Okay. Okay, just because it's strange to not hear anything from you, so I'm not always aware if you guys are there, if you are listening. Okay, fine.
I'll send you emojis as we go to express my.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Great. Okay. So the French title was better. It was called L'indétermination à l'œuvre, indeterminacy at work, something like that. It was like there's a pun there, something like indetermination that which is in a work of art, but indeterminacy that is working as well. So it's like the work of indeterminacy. So there was this pun in the French title. There is, because this is turning into a book right now. And post-Cajun aesthetics and the problem of organization. This is new, this subtitle. I wasn't using it in the thesis because it was more oriented toward aesthetics, not so much. This is me trying to bridge the two projects already. So, can you read okay the slides? They are too little, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, so, this one perhaps.
Okay.
Can you perhaps put it on that kind of how do you call
presentation?
Presentation mode.
Yeah, presentation mode. Okay. Yeah. Blá 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 blá. Do começo, não, do slide atual, né? Era melhor, mas tudo bem. Ué. Okay. Can you read it okay now?
Now it's only stuck on the first page.
Okay, there's a gap, some latency, as we say. I don't know how to say it.
Actually, I
Okay.
don't see it at all.
Do you read the Form and Scale project? Something like this?
Now I can see it. I
No?
see, what I see is the first page, indeterminacy at work, post
Okay.
cases are taking the problem of organization.
So it's not following what when I change page, it's not following.
Now it is. I think it's that when you click on the slide presentation thing, the Google Hangout doesn't read it as being the software's window.
Okay. Okay, so you are now watching the Form and Scale project. Is that the page, the correct page, right?
No, we're still on the first one.
Oh man.
I think you need to exit the presentation mode.
Okay, I'm off the presentation mode now.
Yeah, now a Form Scale project. I think you just zoom in a bit on the page as we go.
Okay, I'll zoom in then. Okay.
Yeah.
This is better.
Yeah, that works for me.
Let me. Yeah, fine. Okay. So. So this is the basic abstract to the Form and Scale project that is posted in the website for this subset of theoretical practice. So I'll just read it out loud just to have this in mind. Form and Scale intends to be a philosophical study in organization through its mediations, starting from the sensible form exemplified in art practice. It tries to disentangle a concept of organization from sensibility by addressing the problem of different scales of organization, from the one that is immediately present at hand to different levels of untethering from the sensible apparatus. This puts forward a function of the concept that is to render somewhat intelligible that which escapes formal integration by our sensibility. Politics and economics exemplify this untethering and the mechanisms by which intelligence tries to retrieve them. A perspectival but not perspectivist philosophy is called for in order to make sense of these different worlds. So, it is just to have this in mind. This is like the goal. We want to bridge this first research towards the project of this Form and Scale. I mean, the first one was indeterminacy, right? As I was talking about. So this is just to have the goal in mind. So it's to arrive at this point where there is this untethering from a sensible apparatus. But we are starting from a kind of aesthetic experience that enabled me to kind of pinpoint a concept of organization inside what was actually a kind of rebellion against organization, because this is the way normally John Cage's work and indeterminacy in general is read. So this is pretty much heretic, I think. So the origins of this project, the area that first motivated these preoccupations was musical aesthetics. My doctoral thesis, L'indétermination à l'œuvre, John Cage, L'identité de l'œuvre musicale, to be published in French in 2019, approached the problems of the ontology of art as challenged by Cage's oeuvre by transferring them to the theory of action, the inferential pragmatic infrastructure of normativity. In it, a model of critical composition was proposed that took not just sounds, but the score, the actions that produce the musical sounds, along with the rules, not just of composition, but of acting in accord with the score as its material. This opened up a common ground between the aesthetic problems and the political problems, made explicit by the replacement of an ontology of art by a morphology of the artwork, and of a static ontology of objects to a dynamic morphology, that is, an ontology of processes. Cage's anti-correlationist stance, let sounds be sounds, was then requalified as a putative absence of intentional organization in the work, which was supposed to grant it its independence from the subjectivity of the composer, was itself recast as a form of organization. Realism was then indexed not to the absence of subjectivity that opened up to a natural given, but to the variability of form itself and the different ways of integration of the outside it can envisage. So, yeah, this is already polemical. The first thing everybody knows about John Cage, is his 4 minutes, 33-second composition, which consists of silence. And there is this standard interpretation that is supposed to be somewhat an opening to an immanence of sounds, of happenings that are not organized by a composer for a listener. That is something that is not composed, that is not produced by a subject to a sensible apparatus, to the synthesis of another subject. So the idea is just to surrender oneself to this immanence of sounds. This is the standard reading. So what I am proposing is that far from this, what Cage against himself is doing is opening up a dimension inside aesthetics that has to do with the ways people behave in accord with rules that are determined by a specific field of endeavor, for instance, music or art or whatever. So this is the idea. So he, this kind of his work can make visible this kind of opening, which is not an opening to the outside in the sense he wanted, not an opening to what is out there and is what he calls nature, but it's an opening into what constitutes works themselves. So it's an opening to the infrastructure, the normative infrastructure of works. This is the idea, the basic idea. Okay. So what's going on here? Okay. So.
Sorry, I don't know the format. You can ask question as we go.
Of course. Please do so.
So in your interpretation, I sense a sense of self-referentiality. Is that what I'm hearing?
Self-referentiality of the work of the composer. What exactly are you?
Work to itself.
Work. Yeah. Yes, you are hearing correctly. The idea, actually, there's also, the next part will make this clearer, because there's a polemic also against the analytical ontologies of art. So the analytic ontologies of art tend to propose or stipulate a category, that is the category of artworks or something like that, from certain components of the constituted practice. So, for instance, this is actually the next page, so I can use this to answer you, right? So, analytic ontologies of the musical work tend to emphasize the conditions of identification of the artwork as a guarantor of its existence. So, they presuppose the idea that more specifically than an artwork, a musical work is supposed to be repeatable or something like that, and it has some general characteristics, and then they reify it as a metaphysical category of some sort. So you have like Platonism and nominalism and a plethora of others, like performative theory, action type hypotheses, all sorts of stuff. But what's interesting is that they generalize from an existing practice, and then the existing practice plus the momentum that it's internal to the theoretical endeavor. These two things together, they create this metaphysical category, and then it's actually it should function as a model, but it's a model that that is walking away from its target, so to speak. So the target has nothing to say about the category anymore. So once you say what a musical work is for all eternity, which is also a characteristic of this kind of ontology, musical works or artworks have nothing to say anymore about what they are doing. So the idea is there's like a weaker argument, that is artworks produce their categories, and there's a stronger argument that needs more than this, needs more than just these elements, which need this idea of a normative infrastructure, and to take this normative infrastructure as a material. So the idea, the more radical, stronger issue is the idea that we can reconstruct the avant-garde impulse as in a piecemeal fashion, not a wholesome fashion. So if you take like Peter Bürger, some Marxist theoreticians of art, they are talking about the dissolution of art into daily praxis or something like this, dissolution of art into life, so to speak. So the idea is this: by focusing on the trajectory of an individual work that takes as its material the normative infrastructure, not sounds, not the sensible thing, but the actions that produce the sensible result as material. If you take this as material, we can create some kind of I would say, I have the French word in mind, dérive, a wandering, some kind of wandering that can produce practices from inside that are not really art anymore. So there's like these two things. One thing is artworks should be responsible to what an artwork is at a specific. Yeah, I know the PowerPoint is not being shared. Okay, as a specific at a specific historical time. This is kind of trivial, actually. It's kind of surprising that there is a whole field of endeavor that just doesn't care about this. And there's a stronger argument that is a kind of what I wanted, actually, was a kind of genericity, a kind of to create a kind of generic practice that is not teleological, not motivated by any ends, but that is kind of a play on the normative infrastructure, something like that.
Can I ask you a question just to make sure that I'm following? Because okay. I had a bit of trouble with the summary of the PhD, just because there were many terms there. So just to make sure I'm following the basic.
Do you want me to share the PowerPoint so you can pin?
No, it works. I made some notes here. It's just that the way that I understood the basis of what you're setting up is we have something like an ontology of art, which is the whole, from what I understand of it, which I'm not very familiar with, but it's pretty much the way philosophers or thinkers try to, let's say, define through some different criteria what consists an artwork. And this leads to a whole series of different approaches to the topic. Then we get Cage, who is usually associated, at least in his work, with the rupture with any normative, or at least with a conscious attempt to interrupt this process by producing a counterexample, let's say, which would not fit any sort of ontological or kind of normative or definitional sense of what an artwork is, because it would blur some lines. This usually leads people to interpret this gesture as a sort of and apparently Cage himself would be amongst those, to suggest that he's a sort of aleatorialist, a guy who is placing what he's doing outside of structure, order, determination,
Yep.
very broad sense, or something like this. And so he would be the founder or the key figure in, let's say, the emblem of a certain artistic, but also theoretical movement of opposing what you called analytic approaches to the ontology of art, as if that counterexample kind of does away with the project as a whole. And your approach is to propose a counter interpretation of that, of his rupture, where, as you say in the end there, it's less, let's say, the interruption of something totally aleatory, disorderly, indeterminate in the weaker, unconstructed sense, to what you said, something more of a, not aleatorialist, but someone who stakes on the variability of norms.
Yeah.
Rather than do away with norms, he relativizes or regionalizes the normative regime, so makes it appear.
Makes it appear. That's it. Yeah, it's
Okay.
totally correct. Yeah, you have the picture. That's it.
So
I
when
would
you
only
say,
take issue. Sorry.
so just to conclude,
Go on.
but then you say, okay, there is from this it follows a weak and a strong thesis. The weak thesis is artworks produce their own categories, since they include within their own production the normative regimes that actually accounts for their structuring. And
Yep.
you say the strong thesis which you connected to the avant-garde movement, which I'm not very familiar with, how, because from what I understand, what you call the avant-garde ambition is a sort of blurring of lines between art and life that is mediated by the fact that the norm and not the material is determining. Is that it?
Yes, it's also it's kind of a reinterpretation as well of this thesis by Peter Bürger, that the avant-garde was supposed to blur the lines between life and art. So I'm not as interested in that as I am interested in the trajectory of a form of practice that can start as art and then can become something that we don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm more interested in that. This is what I'm calling a piecemeal approach, not a wholesome approach. Not like let's be done with art and let's just live or something like that, like the Duchampian gesture or something like that. I'm not that interested in that. And I think that this piecemeal approach is more useful politically as well. So we can use like the previous autonomy of the field of art as like a laboratory of different practices that has to do with the constituting conditions of the practices themselves. So those are practices that are try to be conscious about what constitute their doing. I think this is actually, Gabriel may be recognizing there what brought me to the circle. Yeah, pretty much this conception that the circle of studies of the idea of the ideology, I think, is a kind of practice of organization that tries to take as its object organization itself, something like that. And I think this is this self-referentiality, as Reza put it beautifully, is a kind of constitution. Is a constitution of a genericity, like a generic practice, something that can make us see what constitutes a practice itself. So, okay, there's a bunch of issues with this. This is the preliminary, characterization of the project. The rain started here, so I don't know if you are getting a lot of background noise, but yeah, there's rain, very violent rain now here. So shall I continue? just from your question, Gabriel, I would take issue just with one thing, one little thing. You said Cage was as a rupture of any kind of normative ontology. I would I would I wouldn't be so radical in this characterization, because there are types of ontology of art, analytic ontology of art, that don't deal with the conditions of identification. This is the problem. What Cage does is to suspend conditions of identification of the individual artwork. So you can't really, through the indeterminacy device, you can't really re-identify a work, because they are always different. Yeah, this is a problem, for instance, for Nelson Goodman's characterization of a work of art, of a work of music, right? Because he tries to put forward a nominalistic theory of art, wherein he can dispense with abstract objects. So a work of music would be exclusively based on the score. And there's like this technical device he creates, the notational system, which is a way to guarantee that the score has for each mark on the score, you have one compliant, like one note for each mark or something like this, just one compliant for each mark. And this enables him to say that the work is the class of all performances that are replicas of one another, and of the score as a identification criteria for the class. Actually, this is not very nominalist, because he's using class vocabulary. He's talking about classes, so. But he justifies it in his book, in Languages of Art, saying that it's just a practical, it's more practical just to talk about classes, but nominalistic reconstruction could be offered. Probably a nominalistic reconstruction as the one he does in The Structure of Appearance, wherein classes appear as individuals that are spread in space and time, something like this. So probably it would be more rigorous to say that the work is the individual that is present in space and time, composed by parts that are replicas of each other, and of the score as identification criteria of this individual, something like that. But the thing is, his ontology deals with identification conditions, right? What he has in mind, he has like Beethoven sonatas or something like that, common practice music. So in these works, there is one expects to hear something that is repeatable, but it's not necessarily so. So Cage's work shows this, and it really proposes a counterexample of this kind of ontology. For instance, we have like a performative theory that doesn't go into identification conditions. So I think Cage is powerless against this. So this is just my clarification.
A question, Karen. So if the normativity that you are trying to define is defined based on a sort of self-referentiality of the process itself, and you mentioned that there is a sense of genericity to this, then how do you differentiate between the work of art from other type of work that manifest the same self-referentiality, such as, say, politics or science? Or
yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I'm trying precisely to get to a point there where you don't differentiate them. But the fact is, you differentiate them because they stem from different normative fields. Like the field of art is, if you exclude money laundry or something like that, is normally is a place where you can experiment with morphologies, with structure, without the structure being tethered, bound to a specific use. So, like we can go back to Kant for this. The disinterest that is characteristic of aesthetic contemplation. There is all there is to it. For differentiating the different fields is the initial point of this trajectory, I would say. So you can start from the art field, and then by this procedure of turning a morphology into a generic thing, you actually do get indeterminate about what is this thing. And I think this is a desirable thing, actually. But you still have the initial point that is composed of the normativities that are in place already, always already in place. They determine from where you are starting. So, for instance, you can say whatever you want about Cage being a rupture, but he's always he's always dependent upon norms implicit in practice. That is, for something like 4 minutes and 33 to work, you need a concert situation wherein people stay silent in order to hear a piece of music. If you don't have this norm, the piece doesn't work. So you are always, this is a kind of intervention in an already existing situation, right? And by taking the norms of the situation as material, that is, if you work through the norms of if you work with the norms of the situation as material, you can piece by piece to reconstruct what you are doing in another normative field. I mean, this is just this is speculation, right? It's speculative, right? I admit so, but yeah, I think I answered. Did I answer?
Yeah, I mean, I have my own struggle, if you will, with this. The work that I do, similar to you in my PhD dissertation, I spoke about a general grammar for self-referential normativity, which I call a discipline. But what I actually came short of describing is, since my work is very dependent on Badiou's research, to basically provide an account of why there are exactly 4 conditions.
Yes.
Thinking. And art is being one of the thinking. And somewhere Badiou I've read, somewhere Badiou basically relates this to the attitude towards infinity, that and oddly enough, politics is the only, according to the quotation I read, actually Nina Power quoted him. I've never read the quotation directly. Somewhere he has said that the only condition that deals with infinity as true infinite is politics. The rest have a different orientation towards infinity. But anyway, I haven't read anything by him or from him, or nor in my work I was able to justify why exactly there are 4 conditions, and how do you, through the grammar that at least I claimed that my work creates for self-referential normativity, you can differentiate them from each other. So
can I ask you something, Reza? Do you is in your work the self-referential normativity, is it related to the genericity as well?
Oh,
Is it a
absolutely.
condition for genericity?
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
so there are three things actually. One is I named them differently. One is interiority, that a discipline has to have an absolute interiority, which means that it has no object but itself. There is no object outside of it, which is kind of makes this self-referential structure. Number two is novelty, that this self-referentiality is not a repetition, but it engenders novelty, which is the generic in terms of being able to create procedures, uh, procedures that is indeterminate within its own. And number three is the aspect that has to do with beginning. How do you begin a self-referential normativity that produces indeterminacy inside itself? So these three aspects are the general grammar for what I call discipline, as a logic that we show in this work, and Gabriel helped me a lot in that. That actually dialectic is a regionalization of this type of thinking.
Sounds. I would definitely have to read your work now. So, yeah, definitely, absolutely. Yeah,
really
Gabriel.
Dig it.
Sorry?
I'll pirate you a copy.
You are pirate. Okay. Okay. Looking forward to it. So, where was it? I want to share again. No, it's here. Just a sec. I will share the PowerPoint again. Okay. It should be made faster. Okay. So are you saying the indeterminacy at work project? So central problem, analytic ontology of the musical world tend to emphasize the conditions of identification of the artwork as a guarantor of its existence. Hence, Platonism, I use Levinson and Caivy as examples, consider the work the instantiated sound pattern, wherein sound pattern means an abstract non-spatial temporal pattern that is indicated by the composer in a score. You will ask me, how does a sound pattern is non-spatial temporal? I don't know, but you know, this is the position. So anyway, nominalism by Nelson Goodman considers the work to be determined by an inscription in a notational system where an inscription doesn't have an upper limit. Both a note and a whole score are inscriptions. And notational system is a technical term for a symbolic system that preserves a one-to-one relationship between marks and compliance. The work is a class of performance that perfectly comply with a score. Both positions stem from the consideration of the musical work as a case of one in many. There is some invariance that must be accounted for. Post-Cajun aesthetics tend to rely on indeterminacy. That is, there is in principle no way to identify a work from its sound world alone, right? From its sound world alone. This is important. There is a disclaimer here, like a preliminary consideration. Actually, it's a disclaimer. The object of research is a practical repertoire that uses indeterminacy of results as a way of adapting itself to the site of presentation. And the site of presentation will be urban spaces like lofts, bar, rock venues, etc. No ordinary concert and or academic musical spaces. This is just a disclaimer about the repertoire that I was trying to understand, which wasn't really about Cage. It was about my own artistic practice and a certain scene in Brazil of like, I was calling like a punk Cajun scene or something like that. So in a sense, I am grasping from a specific repertoire, post-Cajun aesthetic in concert works, elements to be transferred to another repertoire, street experimental music. I'm calling this repertoire street experimental music, noise, etc. This is the initial repertoire that motivated me and my friends. The person who most influenced me was a composer theoretician, Brazilian composer theoretician called Valério Fiel da Costa, who was also in this kind of production, right, of aesthetic production. The second disclaimer is ontology, about ontology. the word ontology, right? The critical approach to analytic ontology, my critical approach, asks for a clarification on what ontology means here. I use the useful distinction drawn by Peter Wolfendale between continental and analytic ontologies as stemming from the difference between the question of being qua being, paradigmatically Heidegger, and being qua totality, paradigmatically Quine. Analytic ontology of art puts itself squarely on the second camp, as it interrogates among that which exists, totality A, to what category of being, totality B, works of art belong. It is concerned only collaterally with the meaning of being, as it only asks about that which is considered as existing and its mode of existing. That is, it's not asking the fundamental Heideggerian question, the meaning of being, the being of beings. It just asks what exists. Well, this is the canonical text is on What There Is by Quine, wherein he starts. What was the start? The ontological question is very simple. It's like 3 monosyllables: what there is, and the answer is everything. So he's only interested in criteria for what exists, not the ontology, not the fundamental question of the meaning of being that drives continental ontology forward.
Yeah, so
right?
To understand, so the ontology as totality or ontology as a whole means
as a whole.
Questions of how do you separate what you are aiming at from this first totality, right? So from everything, how do I separate only the works of art?
Yeah, so that's it. This is why I wrote interrogates among that which exists, which is totality A, the totality of everything that exists, to what category of being, which is a totality B, works of art belong. So you are like composing composing different kinds of totality inside of this being as a totality, being as a whole, not being qua being actually. So I think this is a useful distinction because the way both theoretical endeavors ask about being is quite different. So I'm actually teaching a class on it right now. I'm reading the first division of Being and Time by Heidegger alongside On What There Is by Quine, and it's like completely different, even though you have I won't delve into that right now. So
just to see if I'm understanding, the difference is continental Heideggerian inspired fellows are asking the question, what does, let's say, the subtotality A and subtotality B have in common? That would be a greater totality C, right?
No, I wouldn't say that, Gabriel. I wouldn't say that, because Heideggerian ontology doesn't want to turn a being into a being. It's easier with in German sein into Seiendes, right? Into beings. So you can't take being itself for like a collection of beings. It's certainly not that, right? So it's actually I would say continental ontology is asking for the meaning of being as something that articulates some notion or some structure, which is not a linguistic structure, even though language is important for Heidegger, but a meaning structure, a structure of meaning that articulates the being of each and every being there is, something like that. So it's something more like a structural description of what does it mean to be, something like that. Whereas analytic ontology is asking what kinds of things there is, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but what? So the question of the reason why I'm asking this is because I just read the text that you mentioned, and I had a bit of trouble understanding what it means. We can talk about it later.
Yeah.
It seems like the first one.
Okay, the Wolfendale chapter. Yeah, right.
It just
I think
like the continental approach. It tries very hard. It's very hard for it, but that's what it's trying to do, is to move from beings to being, by finding a way to ask the question, which cannot be the question that carries over the ontic towards the being with a capital B, but to ask the question of moving from beings, what is it that is common to them, and in such a way that we're not still refining it into another being, but what is common to beings that would be, let's say, moving to a underlying structure. Whereas,
underlying structure. That's a good idea. Yeah,
okay,
that's a good way
whereas
to
in
put
the
it.
case of the analytical, we presuppose this underlying structure and ask the question, how do I separate only what I want to separate? So how do I arrive at the formula that separates from a previous multiplicity the set of whatever it
Yeah,
is that you're asking for?
yeah, I think that is correct. Yeah,
Okay.
with the additional idea that Quine, by putting forward the ontological commitment criteria, is not just separating something from another thing, but I think against himself, he's kind of touching upon the conditions for something to be considered as existing. So it's not just to presuppose everything as existing, but to put forward criteria by which one can say something exists.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, so there's this other dimension as well to analytical ontology, I think.
I also
So
under,
why is
I, sorry.
go on? Sorry.
I also understand this as the way that Badiou puts the question is the question of one and many.
Yeah.
The way that Heidegger asked this question is there must be a one that is behind the many.
Mm-hmm.
What to be is the answer either as a construct in language or a construction in thought of a one of being being of all beings, whereas
Mm-hmm.
the question that started beings itself does not take uh, as primary, or does not take this to have primacy, that we, in order to deal with beings, we have to answer the question of the one.
So do you think if I understand you correctly, Reza, you are saying that analytic ontology does not presuppose the one?
Yes.
Okay, just a clarification, right? Okay, I think that's correct. So why is analytic ontology important? I mean, for my endeavor, analytic ontology is taken to be a philosophical refinement and reification from empirical art practice. It takes its cue from elements of contingent practice. Musical works are repeatable, performable, have usually a distinctive shape, etc. Turns it into a metaphysical and/or logical category, respectively Platonism and nominalism, for instance. It exemplifies both A, elements of common practice that are supposed to be necessary and are thus selected by ontology. Sorry, in a way, analytic ontology concerns us as a symptom of what is taken to be symptom of what's going on. Sorry, just a, well, are you there?
Yeah.
My computer is behaving kind of strange. Just a second. Um, just a second. Well, this is bizarre.
Did Caron drop? You guys still there?
I'm here, but apparently Caron is frozen. Yeah. Caron, can you hear us? Reza, are you there? I think Reza also had a.
Okay, well, I was going to ask, so I didn't understand the difference between the Heideggerian thing and Quine's thing. Like,
Yeah,
others.
the reason why I got it kind of easily is because I just read, he referenced me to this text. There's this guy called Peter Wolfendale. He wrote a book called The Numena's New Clothes, which is a critique of this object-oriented ontology. And a very thorough one, mostly directed at this guy called Graham Harman. And one of the chapters is called What Are Objects? And another one, no, What Are Objects Anyway? And another chapter is called What is Metaphysics? And one of those two chapters, I don't remember which of them, I think is the second one. No, it's the first one. What are objects anyway? He brings back this distinction. He constructs a distinction between what's called metaphysica generalis, general metaphysics, and special metaphysics, which was classical distinction. And he says, well, this gives rise in modern philosophy to two approaches to being, to ontology. One is ontology as the question of being qua being. The other is the question of ontology of being qua totality. So the first is the question like something like what does it mean to be? And the second is the question of what is the being of that thing? Like what is that? What must that thing be for it to be what it is, right? So one question of being qua being is trying to, let's say, arrive at a common ground for everything of which we say it is. So when we say coffee mug is, thoughts are, what is that is common to all of these beings, right?
Yeah, a property.
Yeah, so what is a common property? Of course, there will be many problems even with calling it a property, because in which sense then can we not ask, isn't property also something ontic? Can being be some of the properties? There was a big Kantian question about is existence a property of things, right? The Meinong and all that discussion. So, but basically the operation is to take beings for granted. Things are out there, and then we try to move to some underlying ground that is what's common to all of them. And that common ground is being as such, right? Being as that which determines those things as things that are. The other approach to ontology as a whole, or ontology as being qua totality, means to try to grasp what it is that things have that make them be what they are. So it's not the fact that they are, but say the mode that they are specifically. So as he was saying, the question what there is, the answer is everything. Okay, but that's not the hard part. The hard part is asking what are works of art? Meaning, what are the properties that they must present, or the structure that they must present, which makes them works of art? And if some of those properties are not present, they are no longer works of art. So you presuppose, or you begin from there being a multiplicity of things, and you try to arrive at the criteria which allows you to separate a certain sub-totality or smaller category of things that are then said to be of a certain property, right? Or a certain condition or quality.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, yeah, I think I understand that. I just seems to me like you could just say being is just the most general property in that sense. Like I know Heidegger's whole point is that that's a bad approach, but
yeah, but that's the whole issue, right? I mean, Badiou takes issue with that, for example, and many philosophers of the 20th century will take an issue with ontology. I mean, all continental philosophers, while accepting that ontology concerns being qua being, take issue exactly with that definition. They say, look, it's impossible not to define being as the most general property. It must be the most general property. How else